Okay, we're getting to the last two sections in this class. And today we'll be doing Romanesque architecture. And I think you'll understand the name when we look at the art. So to give you a little bit of background for this, because I've kind of skipped over some things, but I think we can do that pretty well, and you'll see why in a moment. So first I'll talk about the period before the Romanesque, which starts in about the period, the Romanesque starts in about the year 1000. So the Carolingian period starts about the year 800 or so. And Charlemagne, who was a king of the Franks, so in modern day France, crowned Holy Roman Emperor on December 25th, 800. And that date wasn't a coincidence. That had become by that time the traditional date of the birth of Christ. So he's associating himself with Christ, just as Justinian had done. But by having himself crowned by the Pope and called Holy Roman Emperor, he's saying, look what I'm doing. I'm continuing the Roman Empire, but in a Christian context. So during this time, and we'd already talked about it before in hybrid and Saxon art, monasteries had become centers of learning and the arts. And remember, in Europe at this time, people weren't educated in the way that people are educated today, where you had this universal education, a liberal arts type of education for everybody. Instead, that would be limited to elites and monks and nuns. So most people couldn't read or do anything like that, so it's not a coincidence that monasteries would be the center of learnings and the arts. And what was kind of interesting is during this time, they started to develop in monasteries some ideas about what a monk should be or what a nun should be. And this applies to priests as well. So the first thing that they would have to have is chastity. And basically that means is that they would have to remain celibate all of their lives. And this wasn't accepted right away. There were still monks and nuns who at this time would, get married or have girlfriends or boyfriends or whatever. But there was like some spiritual reasons for it, but there was also some political and economic reasons for it. So the spiritual reasons are, according to tradition, if you read the Gospels, the New Testament of the Christian Bible, Jesus never had sex, apparently, and never had a girlfriend. And there were people in the early Christian community who followed that type of idea. And the idea was, there's something better in heaven, so you don't worry about earthly things so much. But as far as the economic reasons, it goes along with the way that elite people wanted to expand their economic power. So if you were an elite person, it usually meant that you owned lots of land and you had renters on it, more or less. Sometimes you'd have serfs, and we'll talk about them in a moment. And sometimes you'd own a business. There was a few people that were doing things like that in the big cities. And the idea would be that a marriage is a business type of agreement. It doesn't really have anything to do with romance or anything like they do. People think of marriage sometimes in modern times. So the idea is to have a bunch of kids, because at this time, you could die early from infectious diseases and from various other things. So people wouldn't expect their kids to live a long time sometimes. So you would have as many kids as possible. And then your first child, you would try to marry off, or your most attractive child, you would try to marry off to someone from another family who would also be able to expand your economic power or get you economic allies or something like that. And then that couple would be expected to have children, and those children would inherit your estate. So, whatever businesses or lands or whatever you owned, and then continue that on. So it was kind of a family business way of thinking. But people would always have a bunch of kids just in case somebody dies or something doesn't work out. So as a result, at the end of this, once, one of your children started having children, it looked pretty good, like they were going to continue on the family name. Then you have other children, and what do you do with them? You don't want to have complications where after you die, your adult children are fighting over the estate. That would, make it more difficult for you in the future. So what they would do with other adult children is they would send them to monasteries or convents, so for monks or nuns. And this rule of chastity would kind of ensure that there wouldn't be any children that would be out there asking for pieces of your estate. So it's a very practical type of thing to do. As far as like, did it work in practice? Like, probably not. Like a lot of monks and nuns would have sex anyways, but just try to avoid getting pregnant. So another one is obedience. And this makes a lot of sense because the monasteries and convents tended to be kind of hierarchical and have some power at the top. And they would usually have patrons, so it would be like a king or a noble or something like that would give them money. So it would be best if they just did what they were told. And then poverty, and again, this is kind of like a spiritual and an economic reason. So Jesus in the Gospels was poor. In his adult life, he didn't seem to have a job, and he was homeless, and he went from town to town, relying on other people to support him. And so, he didn't have much, he didn't have possessions. He just had the clothes on his back, basically. So this would be useful where the monks and nuns, they would live in really simple quarters, so it would be very Christ-like. But it's also useful because the patrons of the monks and nuns wouldn't have to put too much into it. The monks and nuns wouldn't expect to live in luxury, so it would be basically cheaper people that you would need. And since this is a center of learning in the arts, a lot of times monks and nuns would be the ones that are coming up of theories of government or justifying the power of royalty and things like that. So these are very useful people to have on your side. And we'll kind of see how also they would contribute to communicating certain messages to the general populace. So we look at some of the economic and political developments. So a lot of stuff happened during this time period from about 800 to 1000. And when you see these big maps, it's one thing to realize that most people would not be aware of any of this. Like, most regular people would only have, like, we'll talk about this in a moment, like a lord. They would see that as the authority, but they wouldn't know who the kings were or nobles were or what the countries were called or anything like that. So generally people would think locally. And at this time, since there wasn't a lot of centralized authority, and as you can see, there's like various peoples who are coming in and raiding. So the so-called Moors, that means North African people and people from the Umayyad Caliphate. We would see Viking raiding routes. So the Vikings were Scandinavians, and they were coming in and raiding. And then the Magyars, who are Hungarians, they came in as well. So people would generally be thinking about, okay, I want to defend myself and not make too much noise and hopefully go to heaven someday. So the economic system that was prominent in Europe, and not everywhere, there were other places where it was a little bit more complicated. And feudalism itself is more complicated how I'm going to describe it, but it'll give you an idea of the type of situation that the art was created in, and hopefully make it easier to understand where the art's coming from. So technically, the king owned all of the land in a particular area and bequeathed it to a nobleman who split the land into manors, which were run by a lord. But again, the king in practice didn't really have a lot of power. It was more, you could bequeath these things, but the noblemen and the lords are really the center of power that most people would be aware of. So then you would have serfs who worked on the land not owned by them. So basically they're tenants, and they owed military service to the king. So serfs, you can kind of think of them as like wage workers are today. You don't own anything. and the people above you are taking a little bit out of your work, and you don't get a whole lot in return. And the power is kind of going upwards. But that being said, modern wage workers work much longer hours than serfs would have. So, there's ups and downs for everything. So there's a little power at the top. And people who are nobles or knights, those would be like warriors that were like owned by nobles and lords. They would be able to travel, and then there'd be a few wealthy people, especially in cities, who would be able to travel as well. But most people would be serfs, or they'd be like skilled workers, like carpenters or something like that. And they wouldn't go anywhere their entire lives. You would be born, live, and die in a place that's not much bigger than a college campus. So that'll kind of give you an idea of like the churches we're going to look at and how amazing they would have been to a lot of people. But again, there's little power at the top, and we'll see that some of these churches are kind of geared towards getting more power at the top. So, if you want to get power, you have to kind of give power, and that usually means money. So we'll see how that works. So as far as Romanesque art, before the Romanesque period, which again begins in about the year 1000 or so, there was a huge surge in building Christian churches. And again, this would be a way to kind of for wealthy people and for nobles to give to the church, to give to the priesthood and to nuns and monks, enable them, hopefully in their minds, to build power. So this is especially a case in France. It was as if the whole world were shaking itself free, shrugging off the burden of the past and cladding itself everywhere in a white mantle of churches. So they used to be painted white. We'll see different ones a little bit later on. So church building had been going on solidly before the millennium, particularly in the German lands, thanks to Ottonian sponsorship. We don't have to go over the Ottonian period, so it's not super important. And that pre- and post-millennial religious architecture were part of a continuous line of development. So to kind of get through that easily, we can compare the different styles, and we'll do that in a moment. So how did these churches get built in the first place? Where did they get the money? Because a lot of them we'll see are in small towns. And then how did they develop over the time? So one of the things was because of pilgrimage roads. These pilgrimage roads were originally roads that were built by the ancient Romans, and you can see how they connect some ancient Roman cities. But they fell into disrepair after the Western Empire had fallen. But the Crusades, which were wars to take back, and look at the quotes, the Holy Land from the infidels. When they say the Holy Land, they're talking about Jerusalem and the area around Jerusalem, and the infidels, they're talking about Muslims who are in power in that area. However, that's what they told people, and that's kind of the story, and that's what they wrote in the legends and stories to kind of influence people to see this as heroic or defensive or something along those lines. But in reality, the areas around Jerusalem were just in a really good spot for trading between Asia and Europe. So many people wanted to control those areas so that they could have a good position for trading. You can make a lot of money with very little work being a middleman, and that's basically what they wanted to do. And indeed, many of the knights became very wealthy by occupying areas around Jerusalem and in Palestine. So these roads were rebuilt so the knights could go back and forth. And eventually, other people were able to use these roads. So Christians would make pilgrimages to various churches to see relics. When I say Christians, I mean people that are well off, the kind of people that can travel. So these are people with money. Just think of the people today that travel a lot. They usually have quite a bit of money. And the idea would be wherever you're starting, you would end at the shrine of St. James in Spain. That's right here, Santiago de Compostela. And along the way, because, they didn't have cars or trains or planes, you would have to stop. So these churches kind of were part not the churches themselves, but next to them, these towns became kind of like traveling towns. Think of those towns if you ever drive out west in the US. And people would stay. And since these people have money, they would go and visit the churches and give some money to the churches. So this helped to kind of like build up some of these small towns to be able to create these amazing pieces of architecture. So each of the churches would generally have a relic. And a relic is usually something from a saint or from someone like Jesus or Mary. And it would be some kind of like piece from their life. So like one relic that would be common is they would have like a cloak from the Virgin Mary, a piece of her cloak from the Virgin Mary. Another one that would be common would be a piece of the true cross that Jesus was crucified on. There's kind of a joke that was made. If you took all the pieces of the true cross together that were relics throughout the churches in Europe, you could build a house out of it. So as far as the truth of these relics, if they're actually associated to these ancient holy figures, if you're talking about Jesus and Mary, that's almost impossible. However, some of them were from saints that were lived fairly recently. And this sounds kind of gruesome, but it would be body parts sometimes. So in this case, it's a reliquary statue of Saint Foy, that's Saint Faith in English, and it was built around her skull. She was a 3rd century virgin martyr. That was the most common type of martyr to be in the early church. The idea was to, again, like deny yourself earthly pleasures for, the heavenly reward at the end. So they were kind of like aesthetics type people. But you might notice, like, we don't see the skull at all. Sometimes you can see the relics inside, the actual bones. If you get a chance to go to the Detroit Institute of Art sometime, you'll be able to see that. But in this case, it's been covered with gold, and then it's covered with other stuff. So why is it so fancy? You're probably thinking, oh yeah, this is what they did. They got the skull and then made this fancy sculpture. That's what it looked like right away. But that's not the case. Oftentimes they'd have very simple displays at first for the relics, and then they would build them up over time. So many Christians at this time believe, and modern day Catholics and Orthodox Christians sometimes believe as well, that these saints and holy figures, that you could pray to them and they would be able to help you out in life or put in a good word for you so you could go to heaven. And some of the saints were associated with very particular things that you might need. So Saint Anthony for safe travels, things like that. And whenever these pilgrims would go, remember the people with money, they would go and they would light a candle and they would say a prayer to the saint to get the things that they wanted from the saint, hopefully. And then they would do one more thing to make sure that this prayer would get delivered, and that is put some money in the box that would be right next to this relic. So as a result, over time, at first the churches took the money and put it into the relics. But as pilgrimages became more popular, more and more wealthy people were doing them, this money started to be put into architecture that became increasingly grand and complex. So good for us. So you can see it from the side. Again, if it seems kind of over the top, it's because, they just wanted to show, how much was being given, basically, and how perhaps effective this particular saint was in hoping to get more people to visit. Again, we're not going to talk about the Ottonian period specifically, but we can compare how things have developed. So both of these are kind of developing out of the basilica plan, so different than when we saw in Islamic art and from the Byzantine Empire. Instead, this is more like what was in ancient Rome and the early churches and the Western Church were like. So on the right, you have a plan of Saint Michel, Saint Michael in English. And you can see it here, and then the plan of Saint Foy, who we were looking at before, and Conques. And you can see like a bunch of difference. Normally I would do this in class, but I'll just talk about them since there's no one else here with me. Remember, the idea is relics. So these little areas here would be chapels, and churches would acquire more relics over time, and they would all have contribution boxes next to them. So they basically designed the church so that you could come in and walk all the way down the hallway and get to the relics, whereas the church services would be in this area in the middle. That way, pilgrims could come in and not disturb the church. Where the earlier churches, it wasn't quite that easy. They had the entrances on the side, and they did have relics and chapels back here, but it wasn't as easy access. So you would see a difference there. And the other thing is kind of the spiritual symbolism. This one looks like a cross. So it's cruciform. Christians believe Jesus was crucified on a cross. So they take the church. When you look at the plan of it, we see that. So we can compare it. So only one transept, that's what this is, the aisle that goes across, whereas in the early one, you have two. Radiating chapels, that's what these things are. And again, that's for relics. An entrance at the front, but again, you can go all the way down the aisles here. And then chapels added to the transept. So spaces for more people to pray and light candles and hopefully contribute to the church. On the inside, you can see even more profound differences. The first thing you'll notice is that this one, it's got this style. It's very similar to what we saw in Islamic art, and had developed and become popular in places like Italy, and this one's in France, but it's still the same sort of idea. We can see, like, similar to the basilicas we saw in ancient Rome. We have the clerestory up here, the light's coming in. We have a flat ceiling. It's made out of wood. It's really heavily painted and cool. The interior space, huge, but much smaller than what we're seeing in the later church. And the biggest differences we're seeing is the columns or piers. They go all the way up almost to the ceiling, and the clerestory is out there on the outside. So there's another section. And everything is made out of stone instead of wood. And the ceiling as well is a vaulted ceiling. So an arch, a barrel vault, like we had seen in ancient Rome, and it's made out of stone. So there's a couple of advantages of this. What are they doing here? They don't have interior lighting. If you have a church service during the day, you're good. But then in other places, you still have to light candles so you can see things. If you were actually standing in this place, it wouldn't look nearly as bright. So people lit candles. We talked about lighting candles for prayers. Candles mean fires. Eventually it's going to happen. Someone's going to knock one over. So if you have it made out of stone, it can still burn, but it's a lot harder. So instead of making it out of wood, stone is expensive though, especially this kind of stone. So it developed over time when people gave more and more to churches. The other thing, which is super cool, is it sounds good. So some of these styles, and I'll put a link to one of these styles called Gregorian Chants of church music, had built up in a way that kind of like the Azan, the call to prayer from the Islamic art that we looked at, so that it would sound good in particular spaces. So all the way at the end here, there would be what's called a choir. So the people who were doing the singing would be back here. And when they sang, their voices would kind of like bounce off the top. And if you were sitting down here, because of the shape of this and because it's stone, it would be really reflective. When you're sitting down, the sound would tend to focus here on your ears. And it would almost sound like it's very far away. There'd be this huge, what we call reverb, like a big trailing sound after the original sound. But because of the way that arches focus the sound, it would also seem like it's coming from right next to you at the same time, like it's right inside of your head. So it'd be this kind of incredible mystical experience. So just to go over all the things, I already went over all of these. So it improved the acoustics, and it really made it the experience already, if you're growing up in a medieval town, you've never seen anything like this other than in your church. So it would make the church experience more spiritual, more mystical, more amazing, more taking you out of your earthly problems. So they use the types of vaults that we had seen in ancient Rome, including the barrel vault and the groin vault, and then in later times, rib vaulting. And you can see the pointed arch, which we had seen earlier in Islamic art. And in these periods, they use the pointed arch because they realize it's even stronger than this regular round arch. So this is a pretty typical barrel vault, a heavy one at the time, and maybe a little bit overbuilt. But that's a barrel vault. So it's just you take a regular arch and just extend it out. And then this would be a groin vault. So they have an aisle coming this way and then an aisle going down. And when they meet together, you have that X. So just like we saw in ancient Rome. And then rib vaulting. And this started to happen at the end of the period. And they realized that with the pointed arch and the rib vaulting, this was much stronger. So you could have columns that weren't so thick, although these ones are relatively thick, and then bigger spaces between the arches. Eventually, that realization will lead to the type of churches that we're going to see in the next period, the Gothic period. And we'll look at those a little later on, not in this lecture, but in another one. So the quadrant vault was what was used because you kind of know such a big space between the arches. And everything's made out of stone, so it's heavy above that. So a barrel vault needed to be supported with more than just these columns. So it would be supported by a quadrant vault. So they basically extended it out here and thickened the wall in this place using what are called buttresses. We'll see what that looks like on the outside. But basically, an arch, the energy of the things that are above it would come down like this. So they try to build this as a prop to stop everything from falling over. And on the outside, you'd see the thickened parts that are supporting each of those arches. So you don't only need to thicken these parts because the rest of this is infilling. It's not supporting the building. These are the parts that are supporting the building. And indeed, they would stand by themselves without the rest of this stuff and support the roof as well. So they counteract the thrust of the vault outward. So we're starting to develop technologies that people get some ideas on, some new things they could do. We'll see that come later in the Gothic period. So what's most interesting, in my opinion, are the types of sculptures and sculptural stories that they put on the churches themselves. So one of the places that they would put is the door, a portal. It's just a fancy way of saying the door. So if you're a worshiper, this is where you would enter, and these would be the first things you would see. This thing called the tremeau is a column between the doors, and it would be to support the, to two different doors, but they decorated that as well. And this is the first large-scale architectural sculpture since Rome. So people didn't make big sculptures like this, and since the year 500 or so. So they used two basic themes for this sculpture, the tympanum sculptures, Christ and Majesty, and the Last Judgment. And both of these themes are from the last book of the Bible called Revelation, and it's what happens when the world ends. So the first one we'll look at is Saint-Pierre and Moissac. And just like a little background, because a lot of these churches have legends or mystical stories behind them. According to legend, a dream was sent to Clovis, who was an ancient king of the Franks, and it led him to build an abbey here. And then they eventually built the Romanesque church hundreds of years later in the same spot. So an abbey is where monks live, if you're not aware. So we can see a bunch of things going on. We're seeing new art styles, and we'll try to identify those. But first off, the subject. The book of Revelation is, sometimes it's called the Apocalypse, meaning the end of the world. It's the last book of the Bible. And the writer was Jewish. And they were writing using a lot of number symbolism and other types of mystical symbolism that would have made it sense to to Jewish people at the time. They're educated in Jewish mysticism, but wouldn't make sense to other people. So for instance, the people of the Romanesque time who were Christians and didn't understand it. So instead of thinking of the symbolism so much, they would try to take it literally. So when they saw numbers in there, they would try to display them literally. And when they had imagery that was, from the writer most meant to be symbolic, they would take those things literally. So that's what we're seeing with this Christ and Majesty theme. So to quote from Revelation, and the way that Revelation works is there's a speaker, and he identifies himself he doesn't identify himself by name, but he kind of identifies like that he's a person having a vision. And this vision was given to him by God, and it told him what happens at the end of the world. So it's kind of like the symbolism would be meaningful to people at the time, but the story was meaningful to everybody. The idea is this is what's going to happen at the end of the world, so you should prepare yourself for this. So one of the quotes, and behold, a throne was sat in heaven, and one sat in the throne. We see that right in the middle, the one, Jesus. And round about the throne were 4 and 20 seats. You can count yourself. We got 24 of them. And upon the seats I saw 4 and 20 elders sitting, clothed in white raiment. The paint's worn off this one, but it would have been white at the time. And they had in their head crowns of gold. You can see crowns on each of them. And before the throne was a sea of glass like unto crystal. You can see that down here. They kind of make it look like snowflakes. And in the midst of the throne, around about the throne, were 4 beasts full of eyes before and behind. And the first beast was like a lion, kind of hard to identify here, but over here. And the second beast like a calf. And the third beast had the face of a man. And then right here, sorry. And then the fourth beast was like a flying eagle. In later times, they associated the 4 gospel writers with one of these beasts. So that's what that page in the illuminated manuscripts I was showing you in the Hiberno-Saxon was related to Revelation as well. So what's going on with this? One thing you might want to do is pause this and kind of look at it and say, well, what am I seeing? What kind of styles am I seeing? How does it differ than what we saw before? How's it organized? Things like that. Pause it, maybe write down a few of those things. Maybe put them on the extra credit board if that's your thing. And then start it up again, and then we'll talk. So if you start it up again, in class, what most students identify is that this Jesus is kind of abstract. Everybody is kind of abstract compared to what you've seen before. This doesn't look like a realistic figure. He looks really flat. If he were to stand up, he'd be like 35 feet tall compared to everybody else and extremely elongated. And things are stylized, like the beard with the curls and such. They'll also notice that Jesus is in the center. He's literally the largest. So we have hierarchic scale, like we'd seen going back all the way to ancient Egypt. The animals were also abstracted and conventionalized, like we saw in Hiberno-Saxon art. Also, sort of looks like an eagle, sort of looks like a cow, sort of like a lion, but again, not an attempt at realism. The other thing is that the figures are elongated. So think about like Theodora and Justinian that we saw in the Byzantine period. Those figures were elongated and made them look like they were going to float away. This is even more so. They're really about to float away. And all of the figures are focused on Christ. So along with the hierarchic scale, the way that we see all these lines leading from the eyes, like virtual lines leading from the eyes of the figures, lead us towards Christ as well. And then other than that, it's pretty much perfectly symmetrical. You put a line all the way down here, you can fold it up. You get pretty much the same thing on both sides. And there's a couple of things that Jesus is doing that come from the way that ancient Roman emperors were portrayed, and we saw it in the Christus soul. So Apollo was sometimes portrayed in this way. But very similar to that, Jesus looks here, he's abstracted, but he looks similar to the way that Constantine would have looked like in his Basilica Nova. So he has 2 fingers that are pointing upwards, and that says, my power comes from God. He is God, but remember, he's kind of like pointing to, this is where I came from. And then below, and he's got another hand that's going towards the earth, and it has scripture in his hand. So this is like what is on the earth, these words that tell you about heavenly things. And it's also kind of symbolically a way of looking, just like the ancient Romans, like I'm the king of heaven, and I control the earth as well. For another view, and again, the paint's worn off of these, so it'll look much cooler at the time. So hierarchic scale, a frontal pose of Christ. Everybody else is kind of to the side a little bit. There's no perspective, so there's no background, foreground. We're not trying to be 3D, kind of like the developments we saw in Byzantine art previously. It's a mystical space. It's not 3D. Not only do the figures look kind of like inhuman and mystical, but also the space doesn't look real. Symmetry, a central composition, meaning everything is leading towards the center, and that's Jesus. Stylization, the feathers, the drapery, this doesn't look particularly real. And very elongated features. And that gets this idea where it's kind of leading your eyes upwards when something is elongated. So you get in close and pretty dirty. The birds like to dirty it as well. Jesus is inside of a mandorla. So this kind of develops out of the Apollo sun. They developed this mandorla, and it basically makes a mystical space that sets off Jesus. Buddhists did the same thing when they betrayed Buddha as well. And you can see these kind of like stars that were described in Revelation around him. All of these figures, like we saw in the Byzantine art, going back to Justinian, all the faces look the same. There isn't an attempt at individualizing. So we're kind of taking ourselves away from the earth, like we'd say in early Christian art, and more towards the heavens. And in heavens, how you look doesn't really matter. So a very stylized beard with these lines and with these perfect curls, lots of patterning, less of a focus on making things look real. And some of these end up being quite beautiful in my opinion, and a big influence on fantasy art that people do in the 19th and 20th century. So this figure, which is probably the prophet Jeremiah, Christians see the prophets from the Old Testament as very important. They see them as kind of precursors to Christ, and also predicting that Christ would exist. And you can see how elongated the figure is. This is his hip, and his legs go all the way. It follows the column really well, but it also contributes how his feet aren't flat. This idea that everything is floating upwards. So the viewers of this, again, instead of being brought down to earth like the early Christian art, they're being brought up to the heavens. And as this develops, it gets even kind of stranger and farther away from reality. And that contributes to this kind of mystical effect in some ways. So this is Giselbertus. It's used to be thought by scholars that was the artist, but modern scholars aren't so sure. It might be the patron, so one of the people that paid for it. It's not super important for us. The person originally had a French name, but if you're an intellectual of some type, you usually gave yourself a Latinized version of the name. So that's where Giselbertus comes from. He was just Gilbert before. And this is the Last Judgment, the other theme that's really popular. So I have one where we're seeing everyone around Christ. He's the king of heaven and earth. And then this one is a little different. It's also from Revelation, but it talks about what happens at the end of the world. Christians believe that the souls of people would be reunited with their bodies, and then they'd be placed before Jesus. And remember, Christians believe Jesus is God, and Jesus would judge them based on what they did in life. So if you did a bunch of bad things, you might go to hell, and that's what Jesus is doing over here. Remember, the things that are on Jesus's right from his perspective, that's over here. It's our left, but his right are good things. So these are the heavenly things going on. And then the things that are on his left, would be our right in the screen, are the bad things that are going on. So the people that are damned to hell because they did too many bad things, we can see all the demons here. And even when you go down below, you can see a bunch of them. And then the people that are going to heaven, they're over here. And just by looking at it, even if you squint your eyes, you can see how the lines here are more organized. There's less of straight lines and things seem calmer. And over here, there's a lot more chaos and disturbing type of imagery, lots of lines that are kind of like curling around and about. So you can kind of see what they're trying to convince you of. You definitely don't want to be over here. This is where you want to be. So Adams talks about this piece and says it has a certain weightlessness and disregard for gravity. And again, if you want, you can pause and see, okay, what qualities in this artwork am I seeing that are like weightless or disregard for gravity? So you can do that and then start it up again. So some of the things that most students mention is that, again, his feet aren't on the ground. He's incredibly elongated. So it's almost like, again, taking off into the future. We see a lot of these figures, or off into the heavens. We see a lot of these figures are elongated as well. We have the hierarchic scale and all those things going on. The mandorla sets you off. But, it just seems like everybody is floating and everything's happening in a space that's not like the earth. It's a mystical space. And in Revelation, that seems to be the case. It's in heaven, so it would be a mystical space. So when you get close up, it gets kind of gruesome. So this is on the right side of the picture, but remember this is Christ's left side, so this is the bad stuff going on. We see demons, and in Revelation they talk about weighing the souls. And when they weigh your soul, they can see, are there too many sins on your soul, or are there good things on your soul? Depending on how they weigh you, they're going to send you to heaven or hell. So it looks like this demon is like not happy with a fair scale, so he's trying to weight it a little bit. Demons don't do fair things. You can see how he's got his like hand on this one figure. We have these other like demons or dead bodies like grabbing people and choking them, and you can see how they're freaking out. There's this monster that's coming out of a grave. There's entire cities that are being damned. We have this sack with people inside of it and buildings. So it's a pretty horrible image. Other pieces also come literally from Revelation. In Revelation, the writer talks about how there's a horn that's blown by an angel, and it's basically a way to like break up the various important events in Revelations. We have this angel literally portrayed here. The angel portrayed in this area is the Archangel St. Michael. Archangel is just like a hierarchy. It's the angels closest to God, the most important ones. And their names all end with EL. And they're weighing the souls. What's kind of funny is the inscription says, this is an accurate portrayal of the future awaiting sinners. So this is a warning. Like people at this time, regular people wouldn't be able to read it. But if they went with a priest, they would tell them what this said, and they would look at this image and say, I probably don't want to be in this situation because it looks pretty scary. So what it says literally, if you translate it, and it's all the way across, I'll show you in a moment. Here let fear strike those whom earthly error binds, for their fate is shown by the horror of these figures. So again, this is like a horror movie to show you don't want this to happen. And many Christians at the time would believe this is literally what's going to happen in the future. So all the way across, it gets a little bit more complicated. So on the other side, this is where you want to go. So it says kind of nice things. Thus shall rise again everyone who does not lead an impious life. An endless light of day shall shine for them. And this is kind of symbolic, but they're basically meaning endless light of day represents God and what you would experience in heaven. So Christians would be able to be close to God. And you see how everyone's looking up and they're kind of blissed out compared to the figures on the other side who are suffering. So some of the figures, this angel is saying, nope, other side. And as you can see, people do not like going to hell. It's a horrible thing. They're lamenting. And some of them are a little bit perhaps going mad because of it. And it says right here, Giselbertus made this. And again, Lyndall Seidel has argued that he's the patron, not the artist. And this tells you something that you kind of still see today. So if he wasn't the artist, artists literally would have made this. But a lot of times when people pay for stuff, they say, no, I made this. And you can make a comparison with, modern people that own big companies. They'll say, like, I made this big company, even though they just provided money. It was other people that made it. So this would be a very common thing for wealthy people to think, that their money actually makes things. So we see a development of the earlier Romanesque work. So patterning, even more elongated figures, hierarchic scale, mystical space. Remember, this is happening at the end of the world in the heavens. Symmetry, a frontal pose of Christ, so stylization. So this artwork in some ways is more similar to what we saw in ancient Egypt than what we saw in previous Christian arts. So one thing that would be cool to think about if you want, and if you want to put it on the extra credit board, because you're probably getting like some messages from these images. So two major themes of Romanesque tympanums are the Last Judgment and Christ and Majesty. What does this tell you about the messages the patrons of the church wanted to communicate? What does it say about the nature of Christianity at the time? And you might want to think about most of the people that are attending these churches, these serfs that are working really hard, not getting much out of it, whose life is kind of boring and not very exciting and lots of hard work. If you were in power and were living a little bit of a better life where you have more freedom, what kind of things would you want to communicate to these people? And another thing that you might want to do is, after you think about this, think if there's images of modern times that are similar to this, where it would be people with lots of money trying to communicate to the rest of the population.